ladies and gentlemen, and welcome back to the second day of the Global Economic Policy Forum 2024, organized by the Ministry of Finance and the Confederation of Indian Industry. Our first session today, Sustaining High Growth, Drivers and the Unfinished Agenda. To open the session, I'd like to invite Mr. R. Dinesh, immediate past President CII and Executive Chairman TVS Supply Chain Solutions Limited, to give his opening remarks and take the session forward.
Thank you, Renuka. Good morning to all of you. Sri Sunil Barthwal, Secretary, Department of Commerce, Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran, Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India, Janmay, Chairman, India, BCG. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us here today on the first session of the second day of this Global Economic Forum. We have had the good fortune of listening to many good speakers yesterday, and continuing that trend, we are now trying to decipher how do we sustain the growth which especially the Global South looks forward to, what are the drivers and the unfinished agenda, and of course, we will be focusing on India to start with, but obviously many of these are applicable across the world. We know today that India is at an inflection point, and obviously we are still the fastest growing economy, but there is many more things to be done. And as we look forward to the next decade, it is important to deliberate on the issues, acknowledge that we are facing a very different world, and how do we look at the progress forward in this growth journey is something which we will cover today. I don't want to take too much of time in introducing the topic or introducing the speakers. All of them are eminent in their own way, so I won't get into the details of that. But from the biggest drivers of growth going forward, one focus would be on the next generation policy reforms. And that's going to happen not just at the country level, but across, especially with the states. And how do we make sure that the implementation is done by the required consensus being built? Secondly, garnering private sector investments. A comprehensive, broad range of steps are necessary for unlocking private capital even further for financing this growth. This will also create the necessary fiscal space, and obviously deepening the financial market becomes a core focus in that. Lastly, trade is obviously the largest propeller of growth. Historical evidence has proven that with a significant increase in the share of trade, it increases the rate of growth. The share of GDP, trade in GDP, rose from 32.3% in FY05 to 40.8% in 23. But going forward, how do we navigate this uncertain world, and how do we ensure that we are able to bring together the convergence of the industrial, investment, and trade policies with the necessary funding required to support all of this is something which we hope we will not only cover in this session, but also have takeaways for us for implementation in future. With that, I would now like to invite Janmay to give his remarks and then follow up with the others. Janmay, over to you. Up to you, whichever you choose.
Thank you, Chairman. It's a great pleasure to be here, and I'm going to surprise both the Commerce Secretary and the Chief Economic Advisor, because all the suggestions I will give for next generation reforms will not focus on their ministries, because I attack their ministries often enough, so I decided from this stage I'll just be nice to them. But I'll still pick up 5 areas of policy reform which, to my mind, I think are critical going forward. The first is water. I think one of the areas that India needs to fix going forward is water. And if I was to go from hardest to fix to easiest to fix, the hardest to fix will be pricing water. Then, cleaning the rivers and sewage treatment plants, then cities and the municipal corporations and what they do with leaking pipes and where they set it up and how they invigorate tanks and ensure that Indian cities are not just a plastic sheet. And then what we do with rainwater and what we do with planting trees. And then actually what we do with introducing this as a curriculum in schools. So, it's easiest to, of course, introduce it as a curriculum in school, which will have a long-term benefits. But the hardest, of course, will be starting to address pricing of water, which makes us grow rice in Punjab and sugar in Vidarbha. So this is a problem of such severity that it can actually challenge the republic. States will become so water-starved that it will become an issue of great urgency and importance, and it needs to be addressed in terms of a mission mode, so to speak. The second area I will pick is picked very often, but my suggestion is to look at education differently. We've been talking about teachers training, more schools, better facilities for the longest time. What can we do to supplement these efforts in a manner that can allow us to address the urgent crisis in primary education and adult education in India? If we are to use the fact that we are a population with an average age of 29, and in fact the next 2 billion people the world will come from South Asia and Africa, we owe it to the world to have a better workforce. So what may we do? And, can there be a way of at least providing short-term fixes to education? There would be about 18 million children at the age of every year from 10 to 20, So can we decide to find a way to subsidize and give them a computer in a location in every village and every Mufassil town, to have one place which has power all day long, and it has a safe space where people can sit and get Wi-Fi access, and for a certain set of programs they don't get charged for data, so that all the learning programs are free. If they want to play on the computer, that's fine, then they have to pay for the data. And in fact, it at least starts dealing with people to start learning how to use a computer. And many of them might actually find some of the courses available on YouTube, etc., to be such that they can self-learn. So this would be my second reform agenda. The third would be what we have done in just an unbelievable way. The digital public infrastructure stack of India is world-beating. It sets the global standards. And it has so much power and so much potential that it is actually the envy of the world for those in the world who know about it, and those who are ignorant, well, they can't envy us of something that they're not aware of. But can we create the healthcare technology stack in the same way that we have done in financial services and payments, and actually take this down? And then, we will find a strange situation where the health data of the poor in India will be better than the rich. Because all of us don't even have the prescriptions that have been written in a handwriting that we can't read, So this would actually change if we could actually have a healthcare stack which becomes such that the records become available, and then we can use it in ways which will allow us to do many more things with the data that we have in healthcare. The fourth area I want to highlight is contract enforcement. Whether we take appellate bodies or we take our courts, and I don't want to even talk about the lower judiciary because it's so bad. we really need to fix contract enforcement in India, because contract enforcement is the threat of taking somebody to court, because it will take 20 years there, to get any civil case adjudicated. And without good contract enforcement, the market doesn't function efficiently. And we really need to address this in a manner which is a joint party effort, which we can actually start taking this on. So all the appellate bodies are clogged up and all the courts are clogged, and the lower judiciary is under enormous pressure. And you can't blame the lower judiciary, because the pressure is there in the political system. It is not there in just this wing. It is the country that we are in. But it does create a certain a lack of basic civil society in some ways, which is very necessary for India as we grow. And then the last area I will pick up is digitization of land records. This has been on the agenda forever. So when we talk about next generation reforms, we don't have to have new ideas. We need to just get the stuff that is not done. So digitization of land records will free up so much capital that we can't even imagine. And there is a phenomenal book that Hernando de Soto had written, long ago, and it's still as relevant today as it was then, about missing capital. And so for many people in the country, their only capital is land. And the nature of land records are such that they can't use it effectively to raise money or to actually dispose it if they have to. And the process is slow and variable and open to challenge. So these were the 5 I picked up. These are not the only 5 that are needed in India. There are many others. But we know most of what has to be done. And I just want to end with what one German politician told me recently. I was in a discussion with him and I was asking him a few questions about Germany and why their labor rules are so bad and how difficult it is to get business done in Germany. So he said, we all know what to do, that's not the problem. We just know that if we do what needs to be done, we won't get re-elected. So that does constrain us. And that is a ever real threat in all democracies. And we need to recognize it as I make these comments from the outside, because it's easier to say these things than to do these things. But I'll give 1.5 minutes back to the other eminent speakers on the panel.
Thank you, Janmay. I really appreciate your opening comments. But I think that I just also wanted to clarify, you did say that you're not going to cover anything which is on the agenda for this, but you did cover many of the next generation reforms, if I can say so. So at least you did lead to it. Now I will move forward to Dr. Anantha Nageswaran. I think you have a presentation, so you may please.
Good morning, everyone, and thank you, Chair. Really grateful to Janmay for setting the stage by focusing on issues which are not necessarily, not all of them, some of them are, which are not on the front pages, but which matter. And in some sense, therefore, what I'm going to say complements or even supplements what he said. So right now, the attention is far too much on what happened in the second quarter of the fiscal year, July to September. So I'm starting with that very briefly. It is not that we think that the second quarter slowdown is purely a data artifact, and as more data come in, it would automatically be upgraded. Numbers would be revised higher. Or for that matter, it could be a simple seasonal factor because of rains, because of some religious observance in September, etc. It could be either of them, or it could also be something more fundamental as the ability of the state to spend what is budgeted, and also what is going on post-COVID in the private sector in terms of hiring and compensation, etc., which may also have a longer-term bearing on urban household income, consumption, and savings patterns compared to what we had before COVID. So there could be any number of factors, and we are at this stage not necessarily ruling them out, that they could be very temporary, or they could be mundane, or something more serious. But nonetheless, I think the fact remains that we will be on track to achieve the kind of growth numbers that we had penciled in the economic survey in July, somewhere between 6.5 and 7 for the whole financial year. But that is not the focus. The focus is to how to make sure that we grow at a sustainable rate in a world that is going to be extraordinarily difficult, as we heard yesterday from many speakers, which we are aware, because I think it is not fully appreciated that the last 40 years of paradigm of globalization, continuous rise in trade volumes, free movement of goods, people, capital, etc. All those things are going to be not necessarily possible with the same felicity with which we got used to them. And then geopolitics is fragmented, and more importantly, the agenda of emission mitigation is also a huge overhang on developing countries in terms of balancing their economic aspirations and climate change management. So at the moment, what we are happy about the fact is that on the right side, what you see is that capital formation as a share of GDP was 27.3% pre-COVID, and because of balance sheet issues in the private sector, and now it has increased to 30.8%, a 3.5 percentage point increase, largely because of government-driven public investment. But I must add that the private sector is also beginning to deploy its capital with the much better balance sheets, much better profitability, and that we think will continue. So in that sense, we do see this number heading towards the mid-30s in the course of the next 5 years. The point I made earlier about the global situation was evident even in the second quarter, that there was a spike in global uncertainty, there was a spike in global supply chain disruptions because of the war in Middle East or the conflicts in Middle East and the ongoing conflict in Ukraine, etc. But please believe me that it is not something that will be something temporary. As I mentioned in the next 5 on the left side, these are going to be enduring challenges, and we need to accept them. And that is what will also dictate what the trend growth will be. It will not be something similar to what we experienced between 2003 and 2008, but something lower. That is because of factors beyond our control. Because with all our imperfections, between 2003 and 2008, in fact, there were even more imperfections than now, we could achieve 8 to 9% growth in real terms for 5 years between 2003 and 2008. Because the global environment was far more conducive. And therefore, we cannot take that for granted. And that means we have to double down much more on our domestic efforts. And that is why I'm happy Janmay spelled out some of the areas which are not necessarily in the top of our consciousness. And what you see is that we have listed down, and since it is a little too far, and that is why Dinesh moved to the other side of the stage, and there is no computer here for me to see it very clearly, there are 5 different areas, whether it is MSMEs or agricultural sector or investment in quality and R&D, and continued investment in not only in infrastructure but other areas. These would be important challenges. As Janmay mentioned about things that are not necessarily taken into consideration in normal discourse, we also feel that innovation and a focus on quality and employment and wage growth are also not given as much importance as we speak about investment and deregulation and liberalization, etc. What you see on this slide is that the digital public infrastructure is something that we have done very well, but its potential is still untapped. It is not just a means to improve financial access, although that is a very important component of DPI, but it is also a repository of data. And today, many countries consider the critical minerals and rare earths as precious resources. But India, with 1.4 billion people, will be generating a lot of data. And in the process, different commercial players inside the country and outside the country may be using it. And we need to make sure that the digital public infrastructure and the data they generate are put to use for public welfare purposes without compromising privacy and security, etc. And also to ensure that it captures development across the country, development across districts, and development within states and interstates, etc. There is so much that can be done with this data. And one of the examples he gave was about the health records, etc. But this is we are just begun to scratch the surface. And this could probably add at least 0.5 percentage point to the potential GDP growth in the country. These are the 5 different policy emphases. Again, this is not a complete list. What we think are important. The first one is critical, because textbooks will tell you, as countries grow, they move on to manufacturing and services. But I think in the world that we are living in and going to live in, agriculture should not be relegated to the past, but if anything, it should come back to the forefront, because there are going to be challenges in growing our manufacturing and services in the global context in which we operate. Therefore, agriculture is not only an important source of food security, but can also be a source of export and a strategic advantage. And we need to move away, therefore, from cereals, emphasis on cereals. We need to ensure water security, as he pointed out, and also provide the right incentives. We provide a lot of support to farmers, but as we wrote in the economic survey, if they are retailored and recalibrated to push them into areas where we can become more self-sufficient than where we are today, and also can be a source of export, this has a lot of potential. And employment and skill development is very well known. Small and medium enterprises, I think, well-meaning way, but with the road to hell being paved with good intentions. Unfortunately, our support policies for MSMEs over the years since independence have kept them small, robbing them of the incentive and the mindset to grow. So we should remove the fear of growth from MSMEs, that's important. And then quality consciousness, innovation in the private sector has to be a major part. Addressing climate change, my time is running out. Employment challenges that, according to the economic survey we wrote in July, we estimate that about 8 million jobs need to be created at the minimum every year. For the next 10 to 20 years, we captured the next 12 years here. It is not a trivial challenge, and not only that, we have to create these jobs with at least good minimum decent living wages at the minimum. So it is an important challenge, and one of the ways in which this can happen is, as I said, making sure that our micro enterprises become small, small become medium, and medium become large enterprises. And for that, the answer is deregulation, and threshold-based rules and concessions should be linked to economic activity rather than cost in absolute numbers. If they are linked to economic activity like GDP, they will constantly keep rising rather than set in absolute terms. Some of those absolute numbers might have been set in a different era. And as a country moves from $300 billion of GDP in 1993 to 3.6 trillion, those numbers are still too small for an economy that is on its way to becoming the 3rd largest economy. So threshold should not become tyrannical in terms of holding back growth. And that is what I think governments across the country, union and state, have to focus. Then I spoke about the importance of managing energy transition and energy security and affordability. One of the reasons why, relatively speaking, Europe is facing economic doldrums in the last year or so is, if you look at the rise in industrial electricity prices pre and post-COVID, most of the European countries have experienced a very huge increase in industrial energy costs, eroding their competitiveness, partly, not fully, partly because of the focus on renewable energy and energy transition. That is something we need to do carefully so that we do not throw the baby of economic growth out with the bathwater in the name of managing energy transition and tackling climate change. Without growth, there are no resources to invest for climate change management. And then same thing with domestic electricity prices in Europe, again, has been a major contributor to the sense of economic slowdown. And therefore, this is not only a political challenge, but also an economic challenge for not only India, but global South. And lastly, just capturing all this, generating productive employment, addressing the skill gap, tapping into the full potential of the agricultural sector, enhancing manufacturing and MSME through deregulation, energy security, balanced rural-urban development, continue to support high-quality capital expenditure, and making Made in India synonymous with high quality through innovations, R&D, and quality consciousness. That is one thing that I have not included here. The focus should be also on mental health of India's demographic dividend. The prevalence of massive screen time, sedentary habits, and ultra-processed food consumption is making a whole generation anxious, depressed, and prone to suicidal thoughts. So we need to, this is not just a government responsibility, but responsibility of society and the private sector as well. If India has to reap the demographic dividend, Indians should not only be physically healthy, but also be mentally healthy, which is not listed here, nor did Janmay mention it, so I thought I should leave it as my concluding thought. But having said all of that, whatever you say about India, people say the opposite is equally true as well, right? And in other words, we shouldn't be overawed by the challenges. We have done it. We have grown from 6,000 rupees per capita income in 1993 to 2.12 lakh rupees per capita income, a 35x increase in nominal GDP terms in just 30 years. In dollar terms, we have gone up by 7 times, from $348 to $2,500. So we can do it. Because the average growth, if we achieve, even steadily speaking, 6.5% in the next 10 to 20 years, that would transform. And if external sector also pitches in with contributions in some years, and that I'm going to leave it to my colleague Sunil Bartwal, then I think we can add to the 6.5% trend growth in those years when exports also can kick in, but that is going to be a much bigger challenge than before. So my apologies for taking a few minutes more than what I was allotted. Thank you very much. I borrowed from Janmay, by the way.
Did borrow from Janmay. Now, can I request the Commerce Secretary, Sunil Bartwal, to give his address, please?
So good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I think, Mr. Dinesh, you moved to the extreme right to corner the government.
To see the screen.
But I'm very glad that you have come back to the position where government is also at the center. Okay. I mean, the job of the last speaker is that one has to also take care what has been spoken before. So Janmay was correct that, suggestions have to be given publicly rather than privately, because that is how the corporate profits in India are growing. And he has to take care of his firm too. But yes, very wonderful suggestions, and I will come to those suggestions shortly. Ananta mentioned about the various macro parameters which are very, very important from the perspective of Indian economy. And I will also like to focus on some of them. But since I am Commerce Secretary, and unless and until I focus on what is the role of trade in growth, I think I will not be doing my job fully. So Ananta spoke about how important the trade growth is for the GDP growth of the country. And many times, trade is not understood in the terms of the GDP growth. And let me tell you, which perhaps Dinesh also mentioned, that if you look at the global economies, you will find that Indian economy is one of the most open economies of the world. And this is not rhetoric which I am saying, it is coming out of the facts. If you look at the current position, 45.8% of the GDP is from trade alone. And I do not wish to refer to the Draghi report, where EU is saying that they are much more open than US and even China. I was also looking at the figures. Compared to 45.8% India's trade contribution in GDP, In US, it is hardly 38%, and in China, it is 25%. So I think one very important change which has happened over the period of time, and in fact, if you look at 1991, 92, it was hardly 17.1%. That now we are a much more open economy. And I think yesterday when Finance Minister was here, she also mentioned that now we are part of the global value chains. And India is much more part of the global value chains than any other country. It appears perhaps that China is more open or US is more open, but India is very open in that terms. So I think you should understand one very important fact, that without the growth of trade, GDP cannot grow. And therefore, trade is a very, very crucial element for GDP to grow. We have been doing wonderfully well in terms of our exports. Our exports reached about $778 billion last year. We are growing at a good pace. Of course, Ananta mentioned about the issues related to supply chain disruptions due to conflicts, due to Suez Canal getting blocked. But another important issue which I would like to bring to your notice is that if you look at the trade data, you will find that it is the services sector which is giving the maximum growth to India. And therefore, I would like to focus on that services sector focus has to come, not only in terms of what we produce within India, but also what we export from India. And I think I need not say that the IT and ITES services have done so much for India. And in fact, when I was talking to EU with respect to our EU FTA negotiations, they were telling us that, well, EU may be more competitive in terms of manufacturing, but India is much more competitive in terms of services exports. And they want to have this balance in the FTAs with respect to services. And I said, yes, we will do so, because we feel that services sector has a huge potential to grow. And if you look at another figure, which is again very, very important figure, which you should remember, that the total exports, India's services share in total exports is 43.8% currently. And if you look at the global average, it is hardly 24.7%. So in fact, our services sector, and I will come back to the question which Janmejay raised about how education should be looked at in India, and I will come to that issue shortly. But let me tell you that even in advanced economies, France, it is hardly 35.6%, USA 33%, EU 29.2%, Japan 22.1%, and we are here at 43.8% services share in exports. And when I look at the growth rate in services sector, which is growing at more than 7%, you will find that soon we are visualizing that our services exports will even take over merchandise exports. Or at least it will reach 50% of the total trade. Now, what we should do if we have to really grow, and what should be the focus? So I fully agree with Janmejay that there has to be a focus on education, because if the services sector has to grow, which is a very strong backbone for us, then I think the STEM professionals, the science, technology, engineering, mathematics, I think these are the subjects which needs to be focused upon. I also feel that this is also our strength, our STEM professionals. And I was looking at some of the figures, and I got this figure that 2.55 million STEM professionals graduate every year in India. And this is our strength. And we are the second largest in terms of STEM professionals. So perhaps if our GDP has to grow, our exports have to grow, I think this is one area where we need to focus upon and rightly so. So I think education, right from the primary education to secondary education and to higher education, the focus on digital literacy, mathematical literacy, and understanding the digital ecosystem and the tech ecosystem is very, very important. If you have to innovate, then I think perhaps unless and until you have that mind which can rationally work and scientifically work, you will not be able to reach that higher growth trajectory. Another thing which was mentioned, I think Janmajay said that five issues, but I will take up at least 2 issues which are directly relevant to trade and growth. If you look at digitally delivered services, and he talked about that, and Ananta also talked about it, now $4.25 trillion of services are digitally delivered, which means that trade, our share in trade, share of trade in GDP, the services share in GDP, and then digitally delivered services within the services sector. That is again going to be very, very important because the whole world is moving towards the digital world. And let me tell you, when we talk about, the kind of impediments which we face when we do merchandise trade, similar impediments are not faced when we do the services trade. So merchandise trade globally has been very, very weak, but the services trade globally has been very, very strong. Despite all the conflicts, despite all the impediments which have come. So my point is that India, if it has to have a growth story, needs to focus on the services value chain. Yesterday, in fact, Honorable Finance Minister also mentioned about India's role in the value chain. And I will say that if you look at the value chains, gone are the Ricardian days when wholly obtained products were exchanged between the countries. Now you have a different world where 70% of the trade is intra-firm trade. It is happening within 2 different branches of an MNC. And CII is also kind enough to invite me in the second session, so I think I will be focusing on that issue later on. So let that surprise remain. But the point is that not only services as such is increasing, but if you look at manufacturing, the servicification of manufacturing is also happening. There are companies where servicification of manufacturing is up to 50%. Globally, the average may be around 20 to 30%. But there are companies where service part is almost 50%, and that service part is right from the value chain, starting from the R&D, innovation, financing, venture capital financing. And that is why, if you look at India, a lot of companies are coming to India to set up their global capability centers. And these global capability centers are again benefiting out of the STEM professions which we have. So I think that education's role, the role of R&D, the role of working on the whole value chain of services sector is also again very, very important. And it is not important only from the services point of view, but if we want to improve our manufacturing capabilities. So I think I've been given only 10 minutes. I have a lot of things to say, but I think I will confine myself to these 10 minutes. So what I would say in conclusion is that if we have to grow, and let me tell you that government is focusing on Vision 2047. In fact, yesterday, when we met the EU commissioners, the head of the missions in India, and we were discussing about the Draghi report, which talks about innovation, and which also talks about the long-term planning for European Union. I also told them that how India is looking at 2047 as as a path to vision for ourselves what we need to do so that, we are able to become the third largest economy of the world, not only in terms of GDP, but also in terms of, the higher share of trade and exports. So thank you very much for giving this opportunity, and I'm very glad that you have chosen a very, very contemporary topic which impacts all of us hugely. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir. So I think we heard the three speakers covering, I would call it, maybe Janmay talking about the ones which we don't speak about normally. Anantha Nageshwaran covering the issues which we will need to tackle, so to say, as priority, at least for the short-term view of the growth of India, and obviously that will support the long-term growth. And we heard Sunil Bartwal covering, I would call it, the broader spectrum of how services trade and support which the global economy is going to give can be further supplemented. So let me start with, I think we have about 10 minutes for questions. Before I throw it open to the floor, maybe can I ask what would be the 3 areas which we will need to avoid, as I would call it, to make sure that we can sustain the growth, or the 3 areas which we will need to focus on immediately to be able to sustain a higher rate of growth than what we have today from the industry perspective. I mean, we understand what we will need to do from the various changes of reforms, etc. And maybe I'll start with Anantha Nageshwaran and then ask the other 2 to come with their comments.
So in terms of what to avoid, I would leave that task to Janmay, because it is easy for an outsider to say, please don't do these things. So, and it is a good question, because we tend to focus on all the important things that we need to do, but also certain things, sometimes it is good not to do the wrong thing. That itself will be a great starting point. So your question is very apt, but I'll leave it to Janmay to answer. But I mean, what we need to do, I think, the skilling and the skill gap in these countries has to be identified. So while we say skilling broadly speaking, but specific steps is there are so many areas where what is the demand for specific skills, not just mechanical skills or cognitive skills. Today, for example, elder care, counseling, nursing, all these things are going to become important. So what are the skill requirements? What is the possibilities that exist in terms of university seats or college seats or polytechnics, ITIs, etc. And therefore, what is the gap that we need to bridge? How many institutions we would need? What is the kind of teacher requirement, etc. So that is, we have to drill down to these specifics in terms of addressing the skill gap, because without that, I think the industry will also say we can't hire, there are not enough qualified people, and that is one that we need to do. The second thing we need to focus is also on higher education, where I think we can allow market forces to play the regulatory role far better than we can do ourselves from the government perspective. And the third thing I would come back is this overarching importance of this energy transition and getting it right, because that is an international issue, transcends boundaries, and we need to make sure that we follow it in a manner calibrated to India's interests. And otherwise, that will be a huge drag on our trend growth rate. If we follow the fashion of the day rather than what is necessary and relevant for India, whether it is with respect to non-fossil fuels of energy or e-vehicles, etc. We need to make sure that we follow them at a pace and in a manner that is relevant and suitable for our growth needs. This would be on my top of my mind.
Thank you. I thought maybe the last one is a thing to avoid for us also, right? Not follow what they...
Yeah, I think you're right. You can phrase it that way as well.
Yes. So, Sunil Batra?
Right. So, as a Commerce Secretary, I would say that one thing which globe should avoid is protectionism and trade barriers, because I think whether it is merchandise trade or it is services trade, unless and until there is more collaborative approach in terms of removing the trade barriers, in terms of having more of MRAs where the services recognition, the qualification recognition happens, our nurses can go, our other professionals can go. And let me tell you that there is a huge possibility of providing professional services. And therefore, the MRAs are very, very important. So I think what the globe needs to avoid is, the kind of protectionism which creates more trade barriers, which creates more technical barriers to trade, which hinders trade. I think that needs to be avoided. And I would also say that one more approach needs to be avoided, and that is the mercantilist approach, that, when you are too much bothered about your trade balance and you are too much bothered about your imports, because if Indian economy is growing at 7% rate of growth, which will be the long-term rate of growth, and if the world is growing at 3 to 3.5% rate of growth, then obviously India will be requiring more of consumption. India will be requiring more of imports. And let me tell you that the role of imports in exports is also very, very important. There are intermediate products, there are raw material which are essential. So I think what we need to do is to avoid any mercantilist kind of an approach. And we should look at realistically, as long as we are able to improve our export share, we should not be too much concerned about the imports. So that is what I feel that we need to avoid. What we need to encourage, I've already said that we have huge potential in terms of our services exports. In terms of improving the service part of the merchandise exports, the servicification part, which we can raise, that which we are doing, by bringing in GCCs and others, so that, the pre-production and the post-production. Pre-production may be R&D, innovation, startups. Post-production is marketing, branding, value addition in terms of retail trading, etc. So I think that needs to be encouraged, and I think that gives an edge to India, and I think that edge should be fully utilized. Thank you.
Thank you. Janmay?
So, a couple of years ago, I had written a small piece saying that developing countries are project finance economies and rich countries are working capital economies. What do I mean by that? If you're a rich country, your per capita is high. Tax revenues from that per capita can fund your normal expenditures, and most of your infrastructure, basic infrastructure and all, has already been built. So you are in an equilibrium. Unless you do stupid things, you can stay within that. Then if you, of course, have a war or some other problems, you then borrow, but then you have to, and some of you don't need to repay, but others have to repay. A project finance economy, the per capita is very low. So if you want to become richer, you need to borrow and invest it well so that you can get a return. So the last 4 years, the finance ministry has done a terrific job with infrastructure spending. That's called borrowing and investing it into things that will increase the productivity of the economy. So what should the finance ministry not do? I would not like them to get into populism, which will be a demand which will come. We are an adult. We were from 1947 a full adult franchise. No other country was like that. It was done by the British to screw us, because we had to face all the social pressures from a very poor country, having to pay, like every democracy has to appease the various groups. Now, that pressure has stayed, and it will accentuate when there is a demand from different groups to give them short-term fixes. How we might resist it, what they can do in the commas and the full stops that makes it hard to get it, and so that much of the money goes towards building the things that will improve the productivity of India would be one of the recommendations that I would make and what we need to avoid, because I would really get quite anxious. You know, even post-COVID, what we did was remarkable. One of the only countries which managed without allowing our fiscal deficit to go out of control. And, you know, we don't talk enough about non-tariff barriers. You see, the non-tariff barriers India faces are not the ones that you normally read about. Credit rating agencies are a non-tariff barrier. You know, the Department of Justice of the US is a non-tariff barrier. Think about it. The US right now, one president pardons his son, the other president is a convicted felon. And the Department of Justice feels it is right in its purview to say we suspect somebody in India to have paid bribe to somebody else. We can't prove it yet. I mean, and then you can't access the global financial market because the US dollar is a superpower, right? So we need to be thoughtful about some of these and attack these non-tariff barriers, which are other than the ones that we normally talk about, tariffs and others, because this is part of the overall global ecosystem. And now we have a seat at the table. Maybe not a big chair, but we are certainly on the table. And so we can't be ignored.
Thank you, Janmay. So I'm now going to throw it open to the floor. So Siddhant, go ahead.
This question, I guess, is for all of them, and I think particularly for the respected Commerce Secretary. You talked about GCCs and needing to push up the STEM graduates, but there is also an opportunity because India has a long legacy of history, English, and all these other honors. So if we can try and get, take an example like law, if we can try and get, for example, some law programs or tie up with universities to accredit the LLM course under the ABA, that opens a whole new area of GCC. Similarly for accountancy, there's a whole new world in ESG writing reports, preparing all this. All this is work that can easily be done in GCCs or specialized areas here. So I think the Commerce Ministry can do two things to help do this. One is to look for educational parity and make it a part of our platform while negotiating. And the second, perhaps, is to try and ensure things like data localization norms in, say, the US don't nip this industry. Because if the US says all companies need to keep all their data in US-based servers, then that can completely cut off the entire GCC industry, because how do you localize Indian product in the US, and perhaps there's a conflict in Indian data privacy laws also from that. So that's just a thought for consideration.
So I think you have raised a very, very important issue, and it is very, very important, from the perspective of the general theme which I was talking about, that how to make services grow. And if the GCCs have to grow, if the services have to be exported, then it is very, very important that, there is a mutual recognition agreement and mutual recognition of the qualifications, mutual recognition of the education system, the mutual recognition of professional degrees. And in fact, let me tell you that in Department of Commerce, when we are negotiating FTAs with various countries, this is of paramount interest to us, that whether you are going for the MRAs or not, whether you are giving us reciprocity or not, that is the first principle which we are using. Because normally what we find that, when tariff barriers are reduced, it is very easy for the flow of merchandise to come. But unless and until these mutual recognition agreements happen, and there is a mobility which is assured for our professionals, there is a recognition of their qualifications by the importing country. Unless and until that happens, the services sector will not grow. So we are taking care of that in our FTAs, and that is why these FTA negotiations are very time-taking. Sometimes, it is said in India that why the negotiations are taking time. If you look at the EU-Mercosur agreement, which was signed only recently, it took about 25 years. I'm not saying that we should take 25 years, But the point is that these issues have to be dealt in a very, very subtle manner, conscious manner, because these are long-term agreements. And our long-term competitiveness has to be ensured, not only in terms of manufacturing, but also in terms of services. Thank you.
I would have loved to have asked more questions. I know everybody from the audience have been having their hands up, but okay, I think Karthik, I have to give you the honor of asking the final question then.
Is this on? Yeah, it's not even a question, just a suggestion building on the previous one. I think another major opportunity is given the aging in the West and the need for caregiving, I think working on kind of short-term work visas so that there isn't this expectation of kind of, settling in citizenship. But, and that has massive downstream positive implications of upskilling our kind of healthcare workforce. And then you go, you earn the foreign exchange, you get credentialed, learn the practices, and then come back. So rather than brain drain, you get brain circulation. And that should be a very, very high priority given the aging in the West and our demographic profile. So is that something, because there's a commerce element to it, there's a training element to it, it touches what Anant also touched on. So I would strongly recommend that this be pursued on a priority basis.
So you're asking a question or replying?
It's a suggestion, but asking,
Okay.
if it's being acted on.
Okay, so if I take it as a question, then you see, let me tell you that in, again, our FTA negotiations, this is a very, very important aspect. Normally people confuse between mobility and migration. When they look at it from the point of view of migration. What we are saying that we are not looking at migration. If Indians go there, if Indian companies go there, if they want to hire people from India because, that is how you become competitive, then that mobility of workers, mobility of professionals needs to be ensured. And that is our argument, that we are not asking for migration, we are asking for mobility. And in FTAs, this is the point of negotiations with most of the developed world. You are very correct. In fact, the EU Draghi report, which I have been talking about, also talks about that even in European Union, what to talk about other countries, European Union by 2040, there will be a declining population. So they understand it. In fact, when we were doing it with Australia, we told them that you require about 60,000 plumbers in the short run. But normally, this mobility concept is confused with migration. So I think what we need to do in our narrative, we need to build that mobility is essential for growth of services sector, for growth of professional services, and in fact, it is also good for the developed world that they understand this concept of mobility and do not confuse it with the concept of migration. Thank you.
Yeah, and just if I can add to that, I think CII's agenda has been very similar to it. Every delegation of CII actually mentions the difference between migration and mobility. And I think we have worked closely with you, sir, to make that happen. So unfortunately, all good things have to come to an end. So I think we are, the time's up. So thank you once again, everybody. And please give the entire panel a big hand, please.
Thank you, Mr. Dinesh. May I now request Dr. Anantha Nageshwaran to kindly hand over a token of appreciation to Shri Sunil Bartwal for gracing today's session. And may I request all the speakers to come forward for a photo opportunity, please. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll start with the next session right away as soon as we've turned the table around. Please remain seated. Tea and coffee is served in the hall itself. So request you all to stay within the hall. Thank you.